So my name is Toby Alden, and my presentation is called Platformer Physics, a Basic Recipe. So first, a little about me. I've been making games for about 15 years, and for the past 2 years, I've been working on a horror platformer entitled Love Eternal, and that's the game you can see up here in the top left. And then the other screenshots are just some games I've made over the last decade or so. And I think my favorite thing about games overall is when you play a game, you can really get a feeling of kind of joyful, expressive movement. It's kind of this real, intuitive kinetic pleasure that I think is super accessible and really intuitively enjoyable. And I think as a result, my favorite genre of platformers, because they're kind of all about invoking that feeling in the player. And so because I like platformers so much, I end up making a lot of prototypes of platformers that I never finish, like this one. But because of that, I've gotten really fast at that first part of making a platformer, where you make a character that runs and jumps and turns around and all those good things. And because I haven't seen anyone kind of just lay out the steps of that initial process of making a character, I thought that's kind of what I'd do today. And the reason I'm calling it a recipe is I think it's a useful analogy in that I'm going to show you the ingredients I use and how I combine them, but you'll be able to adapt this, I think, for your own game. And it's not just like I'm presenting you one way to do it and that's how you have to do it. You'll be able to use this to make kind of whatever game or physics is going to be right for you. So to start, before I even add any physics, I'll add a sprite for the player. And some people like to prototype their games using just boxes for the player, like you'll just have a red rectangle you're moving around with the arrow keys. But I think no matter how good the physics are, it just isn't that fun to move a box around, and it doesn't really communicate how the game is going to feel. And I think in general, polish actually contributes a lot to the feel of the game, and I think adding it as you go along gives you a better idea of what the game will play like as you're making it, as opposed to if you just kind of leave polish as like an afterthought for the end of development. So I start by adding a player sprite, and sometimes I'll borrow one from an existing game to kind of help inform the design. Next, I'll add an environment for the player. So again, before I add any physics, I'm doing something like sort of a step up ahead of it. And the reason is movement is contextual. So without other points of reference, the player's motion has no real meaning or significance. And also, adding an environment like this early on helps establish a sense of scale. That is to say, like, how big the obstacles the player is moving around is relative to them, and that'll help inform stuff like how high they can jump, how fast they can run, those sort of things. Once I've got these steps in, I'll start thinking about adding running and turning, so your horizontal movement along the x-axis. And from here on out, a lot of this presentation is just going to be me describing kind of the numbers involved, the physics constants. And for running and turning, there's two big ones, and that's your maximum run speed, which is how fast, the fastest speed the player can run along the ground, and then their acceleration, which is how long it takes them to reach that maximum velocity. And then this third one at the bottom is sometimes I'll also have a number that multiplies your acceleration if you're changing directions, just so you can kind of turn on a dime quicker. After I've added running and turning, I'll start thinking about my movement along the y-axis, so jumping and falling. There's three numbers involved in this. The first two are pretty similar to the maximum velocity and acceleration for your running. It's the gravity and the maximum fall speed. So the maximum fall speed is the fastest you can possibly move downwards, and then the gravity is the rate at which you accelerate towards that. And then this third number at the bottom is your jump power. So that's the initial speed of the player we set when they press the jump button on the ground. And the interplay of these three numbers will determine the overall feeling of your game's jump. So these are maybe the three most integral numbers to the feeling of your platformer. And for example, like if you have, say, low jump power and low gravity, your player won't jump very high, but they might stay in the air for a pretty long time. They'll have a lot of hang time. So maybe even though they don't get very high, they can cover a lot of distance. In contrast, if you had high gravity but high jump power, they might jump high, but they won't stay up there very long. It'll just be kind of a quick up and down movement. So once I hit this part, I usually start playing around with these numbers a lot until I kind of have the basic, something that feels like pretty appropriate. The other small tweak I add to jumps before I go on is I'll add jump canceling, which sounds fancier than it is. It's just if you think about, say, any Mario game you've played, you can control how high Mario jumps depending on how long you hold the button down. So if you just tap it, he does a short little hop. If you hold it down, he does the full extent of his jump. And the way you do this is actually kind of a pretty simple trick. It's basically, you have this number, which is your jump cancel power, and it's some fraction of your normal jump power when you're just standing on the ground. And then if the player lets go of the button, and they're moving faster than this number upwards, you just set it to this number. And the reason you do like a fraction of your jump speed instead of just setting it to 0 is that kind of feels a little bit unnatural, because then the player's arc is just kind of immediately cut off mid-jump. With this, they kind of still have a little bit of upward momentum, so it feels more natural. Afterwards, I start thinking about error control, and this is kind of where it gets a little more complex. But the basic idea behind this is if you take those two constants from the first slide, the run acceleration and the maximum run speed, and then you make two versions of them that are kind of special and are applied when the player is in the air. So you have a maximum, or an acceleration that's only applied in the air as opposed to the one on the ground. And then you have a maximum speed in the air that's maybe different from the one on the ground. And when I was writing this lecture, I sort of had an epiphany about how you kind of deepen movement mechanics without adding any buttons. And I think the answer most of the time is something like this, where you add more numbers, and instead of having them accessed by a button press, you access them via context and changing contexts. So in this case, the context is you're in the air, not on the ground. Let's use the air variables for max speed and acceleration. And you'll see this crop up a number of other times in this lecture. The final movement optional covers wall jumping, because people love this stuff. Wall jumping is pretty similar to normal jumping. One major difference is it's two numbers for its power, because it's not just straight up, you're also going away from the wall. So you have a wall jump power x, that's the speed of them, that they move away from the wall when they jump, and then a wall jump power y, which is how fast they go up. And those two numbers, in combination with how much air control you've given them from before, will determine whether you're able to climb the wall by jumping it up successively, or if you won't be able to do that because when you come back to the wall, you've already fallen lower than when you started. And then again, you have these kind of context switching constants from earlier, where now we have a new gravity and a new maximum fall speed that is only applied on the wall. And that kind of helps sell the illusion that the wall has some friction to it, you're kind of clinging to it. Just helps improve kind of the overall sensation. And then lastly, I have this kind of special number, wall stickiness. That's just how long the player has to point the analog stick away from the wall before they actually detach from it. And that just kind of helps avoid situations where like maybe they want a wall jump off, but they moved the stick before they pressed jump and they detached from the wall, and now they're confused because like they thought they did it at the same time. So it just kind of helps the player along. So that's a lot of numbers you have to pick. And because of that, I thought I would just impart some kind of general tips I've learned for picking numbers. I think the biggest trick I've learned is to not fine-tune numbers by adding or subtracting to them incrementally, because you kind of just get tunnel vision and you can't really tell the difference. So instead of doing that, I would recommend you just, if there's a number you're not sure about, just either have it or double it. And then how it's changed will be immediately apparent. And then if you need to adjust it more finely than that, you can kind of just average between the original and doubled number. So in the example I have here, it's like, let's say your jump is 100 and it doesn't feel powerful enough. Instead of going like, oh, well, what does 110 feel like? What is 120? You can just try, okay, let's just crank it up to 200. And then it's like, oh, that's way too much. But 100 was too little. So I know the answer is somewhere in between those, and you can try 150. The other thing I would recommend is, even though it's really fun, don't spend longer than a half hour tweaking numbers. Because, again, tunnel vision, you just kind of like, each change you make has less and less impact because you're just getting too used to it. And then don't let too many undecided numbers pile up. This, of all the slides they gave, there were probably like, well, I could count them, but those are all the constants involved. But I wouldn't like implement everything and then be like, okay, now it's time to decide values, because it's just too many numbers to balance against each other. It's easy to balance 2 or 3 numbers that are interrelated, but once it gets higher than that, it's just too much to keep in your head. So pick rough values as you go would be my recommendation. Finally, I want to just quickly touch on a few polish effects I think really add a lot. One is dust clouds. This is pretty self-explanatory. It's just when the player jumps or when they land or when they're sliding down a wall, you just kind of make a little particle effect behind them. And I think it kind of helps sell the illusion of weight and make it feel more tactile. And in a similar vein, I also like to give my games squash and stretch. So the player sprite, when they land, it squishes down. When they jump, it stretches up. And this kind of just helps convey the illusion that like, oh, when they're jumping, they're really getting yanked up by this force. And then when they land, they're really just kind of getting slapped down. And I think it gives the player kind of a nice sense of elasticity. It kind of feels like you're controlling like, I don't know, a little flea or something. And then finally, I just want to express the importance of sound effects. This was kind of going back to how I said it's good to like add some polish early on. Sound effects, more than anything, I think, contribute the most to this, to like the overall feel of your game. And compared to graphics, they're pretty cheap to implement from a coding perspective. So I would just say have sound effects for everything. Like have sound effects for obvious stuff like running and jumping, but also stuff like, if they're running full speed and then they turn, add a little scuff sound effect to really sell that. A little sound when they're sliding down a wall. Everything contributes a lot. So sound effects, good stuff. Lastly, I just kind of want to address this. You'll sometimes encounter this notion in like Steam reviews and that kind of thing, that there's a sort of Platonic ideal for platformers, that there's like this right way of doing things that every game should be aspiring towards, and if it doesn't feel like that, then you messed up. But as someone who really likes platformers, it would be really boring for me if they all played the same. I want different games to play differently, and I want to be able to express myself via movement in them differently. And I want that to like apply to this kind of formula I've just given you too. Like, even though it in of itself is pretty flexible, it's still not the only way to do things. And I think any one of kind of the points I've touched on, you can also reframe as like a design challenge. Like, how would I design a platformer without this constant? Like, what would a platformer with no maximum run speed look like? Or a jump power that wasn't consistent? And so in the spirit of that, I just want to end this lecture by giving some examples of platformers with unconventional physics that I really love. Because I think there's a lot to be learned by studying a game with well-executed conventional physics, like Celeste or something. But if all you try to do is emulate it faithfully, there's a good chance you'll kind of just end up making a slightly worse version of that game. So I would encourage you to kind of embrace your game's weirdness, especially when it comes to how the player moves. Because the world needs more weird-feeling games and weird ways of expressing yourself. That's it. I think we have time for maybe a couple questions.
Do you have any fancy tricks for cameras?
Do I have any fancy tricks for cameras? No. The games I've made with cameras, I always just center the player directly in the middle of the screen. Sometimes I'll have screen shake, but honestly, most of my games are single screens without much camera movement, so no, sorry.
Are there other values in addition to the ones that you showed that you've thrown in as your game's weird variable that are not, I guess, is this kind of the typical setup for you and that's what you're tweaking, or are there some other variables that you added that are integral to how that feels that kind of throws it for a loop as the weird part of your next page or new prototype, anything like that?
Yeah, so I'll try and paraphrase that question. The question was basically, are there other variables I'll kind of add on top of the ones I listed here that kind of make the game weird, essentially, or kind of give the game, more interesting or unique movement? And I guess the answer is sort of. What I find most of the time is that this is kind of the base model I start from, and then the weird or interesting stuff doesn't really come from new constants, but kind of weird duct tape-like solutions, where I'll it's like in this specific situation, I'll multiply this number by 2 or something. Because I think this is kind of the most general I get with this stuff, and then to make an actually nice feeling game, there isn't, like, if you try and follow a formula too rigidly, the player is kind of able to tell. And I think the best way to make a good feeling game a lot of the time is kind of ugly code, like lots of little hacks littered throughout. So I do a lot of that.
Do you have a preferred engine that you use to build platform games?
I do. The question was, do I have a preferred engine for making platformer games? So all the games in the GIFs you saw were made using a framework called Haxpunk. And I like Haxpunk. I think it's cleanly designed, and it exports to the web and desktop and ostensibly other stuff really well. But it doesn't have much online support. There isn't much of a community for it, and it isn't really regularly updated, so I don't know that I can wholeheartedly recommend it, but it's what I use, and I like it.
The last slide they had were all examples of other games. I'm curious if you could give, if you feel comfortable giving a little pitch for the 4 as to what the weird movement is that they introduced.
Oh, sure, yeah. So the top left is Sun Gorth by Rocket Donkey, which I actually played for the first time at a PIGSquad event. It's really hard to describe. I want to talk to the creator to figure out how they made the movement feel as interesting as it does, but I think part of it must just be not having caps on velocities. It feels like you can really just launch the player around. See, bottom left, The Wings of V by Solgren. This is Solgren got famous making I Wanna Be the Guy fan games, and if you've ever heard about I Wanna Be the Guy, it's kind of this comically hard game, and then you can imagine the fan games of that are even harder and more comical. So he got famous making those, and then he made this, which was kind of his first big commercial project. And it's just kind of an interesting study in what design avenues open up for you if the player consents to being hurt from the get-go? I guess is how I would describe it. Quest of Key is my favorite AES game. It's really funny. You can jump as high as you want, but if you bonk your head, the player holds their head and is in pain and slowly floats to the ground. And they just do a lot of funny stuff with that, and it's really joyfully frustrating. And then within a deep forest, you're a ball, you're constantly bouncing, and you adjust the elasticity of the ball instead of choosing when to jump. So it's just kind of an interesting inversion.
Thank you.
I think that's all the time I have, so thank you.